Hey everyone, welcome to the Intentional Churches podcast. Our heart is to help you clarify vision, improve decision making, and stimulate growth in your church, no matter the size, denomination, or context. We're passionate about seeing disciplined conversations and disciplined decisions create a sustainable, lasting impact in the community where you serve. I'm your host, Jesse Anderson, and I'm joined by Intentional Churches co-founders Bart Rendell and Doug Parks. Their book, Intentional Churches, How Implementing an Operating System Clarifies Vision, Improves Decision-Making, and Stimulates Growth, is available now anywhere you get your books. And our purpose with this podcast is simply to summarize the high-level and key principles from the book. Today, we're going to share a component of ChurchOS called the engagement pathway. And if you haven't heard the episodes that have come before this, you specifically will want to go back and listen to episode 3, which explains the Great Commission engine, really the centerpiece of ChurchOS. And so we're going to talk about how the engagement pathway fits into that. The Great Commission engine is the centerpiece of ChurchOS, like I said, and it's built on biblical basics of reaching the one that Jesus talks about in Luke chapter 15, and really fulfilling the mission that Jesus gave to every church. So that's where we're headed today. A couple of things before we get into talking about the engagement pathway that I think is important. First of all, understanding that the engagement pathway is not a discipleship pathway. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is how are we connecting the one to us, Jesus, and others. So Bart, would you just talk a little bit about the engagement pathway, how it fits into ChurchOS?
Sure. If you do look back at the Great Commission engine, context to me is important when we're even when we're working with a team. You know, we make an effort to constantly tie everything together. So I appreciate the question. The engagement pathway really is a simple, if you were to break it down, is how are you going to get from one key element, biblical fundamental in the Great Commission engine, to another? And more specifically, how is the one going to get from one element to another? So sometimes I'll tell a team, just think of it this simply. If they came to your weekend experience, hopefully on the arm of a friend, and they were spurred on by the Holy Spirit, sparked to make a step of some kind, let's say into a small group, how easy is that step or series of steps to get into a group? We know group and life-changing relationships are key to accomplishing the Great Commission. That's the second piston in the Great Commission engine. So this then continues on between all of the pistons and core activities. And how easy is it for the one to get connected into those core activities, stay there and grow up and be nurtured in those activities over time? That's the key question. And like you said, we just say it again and again. If you don't connect the one to you, Jesus, and others, we lose. It's what it's all about. We're not going to be an advancing church the way God intended. And so we're going to walk through what that means. It's a very key element. These ideas have been around in the kingdom before. Churches have taught on them. I went to an assimilation conference back when I was like in my 20s, fresh out of seminary. And so, we need to kind of regroup again on this conversation. It is key to the church accomplishing Jesus' mission.
And really, it's key to seeing double impact, what we would talk about. We're going to talk about that in the next episode with Vision, but basically, what's the goal of growing and impacting your community? This is a key piece.
It is.
Because if people can't move through the church and get connected, then they're not going to be at that place. So it's a really key element. And one thing that I want to clarify, especially if you're listening to this and you're not looking at the book or you don't know this visual, the engagement pathway is really a top-down funnel. And at the top is the relational reach zone we've talked about, which is simply the relational connections that the people already in your church have with those in your community. And that's really what feeds into the funnel. An engagement pathway disconnected from the relational reach zone is not going to be effective in what it's trying to do.
Right.
What we're trying to do is connect it to the reach zone and like you said, coming on the arm of a friend, but then how are people walking through the steps? And so it's important that we understand the whole system. The book dives into so much more of this. And so we're trying to connect the dots as much as we can, especially if you're listening to this. But I think it's important just to kind of get that visual. So let's talk about it. I assume a lot of pastors,
I just
Doug,
want
you
to
got
say
thoughts.
very quickly, that is one of the biggest mistakes we've seen. Whether you came in, like Bart said, he went to an assimilation conference or sessions to learn. All of us who are a little older remember Nelson Searcy and his assimilation push that was kind of rooted in the baseball diamond from Saddleback and Purpose Driven. But I just don't want you to pass by it too quickly. Most times when we walk into a church, the way that they are assimilating or connecting people is disconnected from their relational reach zone. Okay. They are not thinking about that bridge. And so I just want to make sure that gets highlighted from the very get-go. Like, it is critical that those are seen as one and the same. Like, we're not separating this off.
That's good.
Does that make sense?
And just to tie another thing back that's crucial, everything in the Great Commission engine and Church OS is focused on the one. And so that's really where that relational reach zone comes in. This isn't just about the people who wander in, and we've got to be able to connect them. So that's an important thing. Okay, so I assume a lot of pastors and church leaders are listening saying, we already have a quote-unquote engagement pathway for new people. Next episode, please. Like, we're good. We got this. But just because some sort of connection path exists doesn't mean that it's effective or successful in connecting the one to you, Jesus, and others, that's the essence of what we're trying to do here. And there's 6 principles that are outlined in the book that constitute a healthy and effective engagement pathway. Who wants to start with principle number 1? Bart's got a look in his eye, but Doug's going.
You want to hit it?
Yeah, I want to talk about the opt-in.
Opt-in, yeah.
And, part of the reason why having the one-aware filter on when it comes to your engagement pathway is this idea of opt-in. And what that means is it's something that a one, or I would add as kind of in parentheses, a disconnected 99, really identifies with and says, I want what you're offering. So it's super important here. Like, in a lot of churches we'll walk into, and we listen to their bridge where they're trying to get somebody to go to a welcome center or fill out a connection card or whatever that thing may be. It is oftentimes not thought through the lens of a one, and definitely not formed as an opt-in. So one of my favorites is, what one ever, like at the end of a service when you say, hey, we'd love to meet you. What one ever is thinking, I want to go meet that guy that's up on the stage. It's just it's not an opt-in phrase, where if you get in a real, why did that one come to church? That one came because they wanted something better in life. So if we frame that setup for that opt-in moment where it's more, hey, we're a people around here about leading a better life, being a better husband, a better father. And the way we found to do that is to follow Jesus. That's more of an opt-in communications thing that's it's maybe seem minor, but it is a huge deal when it comes to this principle of opt-in.
And if let me just say, if you've built your one aware filter, I think, again, the number one thing we could say through all of this is make it about the one, not about you. And so always, all the way through. And it's funny how quickly we will see churches make it about the church, right? So it's the first thing you offer is a learn about us thing. Well, that really usually for the one, if you've done your one aware filter correctly, they don't really care a lot about you yet. They're probably hurting. They need hope. If you've gotten into the world, you understand the core motivators we talked about last episode and in that chapter on the one. And you have to jump over the fence, I'll say, and meet them where they're really at, where they're really living, and give them a meaningful, we're going to talk about the principles, but give them something, like Doug has said, that makes sense to them, that they will opt into, that doesn't feel like a forced, hey, I do want to get to know people, but you just said, learn about you. I am not ready, really.
Right.
That's not really motivating. But if you're going to force me to do that, then I'll maybe do that, but I got to have a pretty high pain threshold to go learn about you right now.
And I'm going to give you a crappy, leaky cup as a gift to try to incentivize you to come do that, like that I don't even want. I do think it's, it is so important here that you personally, we talked about this in the previous episode, that if I have a one aware filter and I'm thinking about my one, here's a key question when you're thinking about your engagement pathway. What would my one say yes to? And if that question could govern our thought, as opposed to what would our ministry leader want, or what would our church want?
Interesting.
But what would my one say yes to next?
Yeah.
That is really what we need to be thinking about in our engagement pathway.
That's really good.
So at my church, we found out, so another thing we need to teach right here is building an effective engagement pathway takes time. It takes a lot of trial and error. And we're going to walk through the principles, but just be patient.
It's not a set it and forget
It's
it.
not a set it and forget
No.
it. And you're always going to be addressing, you should be. It's a core element. If you don't have it, you will quit growing. So we found that it was pretty simple. If they needed to be, they wanted some prayer. They probably wanted to be cared for a little bit, like sat down, their story heard, and some meaningful care take place. They sometimes we had a big church and they wanted to know where to find their car. Okay, but at the end of the day, you are receiving them, and it's not you're not catering in a bad way. With a heart, you're jumping over the fence and going, how can I help?
Yeah, that's good.
And how can I lead you to the right next step for you? Ultimately, you want to help them meet Jesus.
Yeah, and this really connects with the next principle, which is all about simple steps, not just for that first one,
right?
But that they're all simple steps, not giant leaps. That unfortunately, churches tend to be notorious for building barriers to entry rather than simple, doable steps. We're either asking too much or we're asking something that we're comfortable with, but maybe the heart is right, but in the ask and in the strategy, it tends to be more of focused on us, that we find that people aren't able to step into it. Talk about simple steps and how important that is.
Can I give you my favorite non-simple step?
I would love to hear it.
So I was supposed to go to this church, let's say, and we were working with them, and you wanted me. I learned about small groups and the power of life-changing relationships through a powerful testimony you gave, perhaps. And I wanted to get into a group. I want to know what these things called small groups are, or whatever you name it, life groups, whatever. And their strategy for it was, next step was to go to the lobby, and there was a wall of groups, and the wall had the picture of the group leader and their family, if they had one, where they met, when they met, and a little bio. And you were supposed to go to the wall and self-pick, or opt in the group you wanted to show up. I'm a committed 99er. I'll find my way through most of bad engagement pathways, right? Mm-hmm. But I would never go to the wall and pick a random person off the wall and show up at their house on Thursday night or give them a call. That's called a giant leap. So that's not a simple step. So it's almost like you can't break down the steps too simply in some ways. And listening to those that have connected, and the barriers to connection is important. But anyway, that's just one of my favorite examples of what a giant leap looks like when you're talking about getting into a group.
Now juxtapose that with a simple step for getting into a group. What would it look like? Something that would feel a lot more doable.
Right. So there's several things I've seen, but our church for a while did this cool event where it was fun and festive, and it was a connections event where we let you find a group in the event, have a little meeting in the event with them, get a feel for the friendships, and we did a few exercises creatively around affinity and part of town you meet in, and the type of whether you have kids or not and what age they are, and these affinity groups would meet together. And the barrier to entry was lowered already just because of the work to get them matched up with affinity. And then next, you had a little meeting right there to get to know each other. Mm-hmm. And now the simple step of meeting next week at someone's house is actually a possibility. And it's even more of a simple step if I remove the lifelong commitment barrier, meaning I'm going to, as a group leader, over groups in church, I'm going to call you and see if that was a good fit or not. And then I'm going to try to find the right fit for you. So those are all ways that could get broken down into
I'm going to give one
steps.
outside of church context about simple steps right now, because all of us are trying to figure out this digital thing.
Side, yeah.
I would say to anybody out there, no one's cracked the code. We're all used to going to the teaching churches who might be ahead of us, and there are some that are advancing and really, but no one's figured out true digital engagement. For the most part, we're all trying to copy digitally what we're doing physically. So I just think, give us all permission to experiment right now. It's okay. But here's an example from the marketplace of simple step thinking. There's, if you haven't seen it, there's this new diet kind of thing called Noom. And if you get on their website, they're taking you through simple steps where they're getting to know you by asking you questions and engaging you more and more, moving you toward a purchase, but it's not ever giant leaps. It's just a great, as you're thinking about digital, and even then, how do I transfer that learning back into the physical? I just really respect how they are moving people through their sales cycle, if you will.
That's really good. And before we move to the next principle, I think I just want to make sure this isn't about a simple step into the engagement pathway. This is simple steps from each of the pistons through the Great Commission engine and deeper into engagement. So this is an entire thing, not just the first step, but this has got to be a principle that leads throughout the engagement pathway. The whole thing is based on simple steps into a small group, into a next, whatever it is. Okay, there's a lot to say on the next one, which is that we talked about that we've got to have an engagement pathway that is built on being opt-in, simple steps, and the third one is relational. I want to mention something from just a great resource, the book called What Every Pastor Should Know, 101 Indispensable Rules of Thumb for Leading Your Church. Like the best title ever. And actually, it's a great book. It's by Gary McIntosh and Charles Arnn. It came out, I think, in 2013. Unbelievable in terms of just kind of those things, like whether you're a church planner or whether you're a seasoned guy. If you're a seasoned guy, you probably know about 99 of these through hard knocks and 30 years of ministry. But if you're starting out, it's like, man, there's stuff about square footage and per capita giving and
that's great.
all sorts of stuff. So it's simple. Amazing. But one of the things, and this is mentioned in the book, in Intentional Churches, is this principle. Once a person has made 7 friendship connections at your church, they consider themselves part of your church family. So the sooner the one knows and feels known, the sooner the one will feel connected to your church and will call your church home.
Think about that.
So that's just, there's a lot we could say in the relational, but that's a huge deal. Like how quickly can we get people connected to others? So that sets up the conversation, but I know we've got a lot to talk about here relational.
So this is, especially in the mega church era, if you think about it, 30, 40 years ago, mega churches were an anomaly. And now that's like, there are, in the mega churches, over 1,000, some say over 2,000. In it somewhere, in all this going to the teaching churches like we have over this run, and not really our seminaries, the teaching churches have taught us, we have lost track of something, and that is we are in the people business. Especially when you're trying to move and connect large numbers of people, you can fall prey to systemization that is more automated than relational.
Wow.
So like, for instance, a connection card for years and years was a connection tool that we used. But it's if you really get under the hood, most churches have set up their connection card to be transactional and not relational. And so we would encourage you on this relational concept. Hey, collecting somebody's information is great, but that should not be what you lead with, because what you're communicating to a 1 or a disconnected 99, you're communicating transaction. You're not communicating relationship, which is, we would argue, along with Arnn and McGavern, that is one of the reasons why people show up at church. And so how do we get like, for instance, one of our rules of thumb is get rid of the desk, the welcome center, the desk that puts a barrier between you and someone else. And really try to promote more of a bar height table or something where you can be conversational and relational.
About getting rid of the physical barrier.
Getting rid of the physical barrier. And we're not saying get rid of the communication card, but I've seen a number of churches who have perfected, the system. We send an email by here, we do this by there, and they've lost sight of it really is a relationship. And so even though we're designing a system, we have to bring relationship in as soon as we can.
So Doug uses the phrase inject sometimes.
Yes.
How quickly in the path can we inject relationship or create it?
That's a good question.
So we did, and you really could you can get creative. When we did some of our, I could go on and on about the class work we were doing at church to get people connected and realizing the truth about their life. One thing we realized early on, though, was this idea they needed a relationship. So we put table hosts whose job it was to get to know the people that were there, and we trained them, and then their job was to actually follow up with those people the next week. Something simple like that. I think you can train your ushers and greeters to be relational. You can train your information folks to be relational. I mean, it really...
And make them the follow-up point, not the institution of the church is going to call you in 2 days. I'm going to
get your name back to the guys.
It's like, literally, you met me, and I'm the one calling you and following up and saying, hey, I'll see you here next week.
And here's one more cool thing that's happening is I think generationally, the millennial generation, who is a lot of who we're going to be reaching for the next 15, 20 years, is very relational, sort of, they're looking for friends and relationships kind of more readily than, say, our generation, Gen X, was. We were kind of cynical and you had to overcome some barriers, right? We were distrusting of institutions. So like I see churches trying things like a join a team area in the lobby as a first step. So in other words, they're so relationally driven that a baby step they might actually take is to get into a relationship with you guys before I know anything. Join a team? Oh, that sounds like fun. Go serve somewhere with the team? That sounds like fun. So in other words, relationship is kind of going to be a cool, I think, strategy almost to lean into when it comes to engagement.
And I know we got to get to a couple more principles, but I do want to say something here because we kind of threw it down at the beginning that this word discipleship is a very, very controversial word. And it literally, you walk in a room with 10 pastors and it might mean 10 different things. And so some pastors may believe, we're discipling if we get them through the baseball diamond 101 or a growth track. And others are like, no, but under this relational umbrella, I do want to highlight, if you are wanting to make your engagement pathway more of a discipling mechanism, the quicker and sooner we have leaders who see their role not as to lead the organization, their role is to disciple and grow up and multiply themselves, the quicker we're actually accomplishing Great Commission. So this is a missing component when you systematize so much that you forget that true discipleship requires relationship. And so that's why we say inject into the engagement pathway as quickly as you can. I think in a large church, this puts a tremendous amount of pressure on something we're not very good at, and that is leader development. I would argue 70-80% of leader development should be in mentoring and discipling as opposed in corporate leadership skills, which are important, but not as important as the discipleship side.
So the next two principles, I think, are slightly connected, not only to each other, but to some stuff we've already talked about, and it's unpacked further in the book. But principle number 4 is that your engagement pathway must be sequential. People don't want to feel processed. They want the next step to make sense. And principle number 5 is that it's meaningful, that it's built to deliver and add value to the one. We've talked a little bit about both of those in some different ways, but thoughts on those two principles?
Well, people think, Andy wrote a book, and this was in the book way back, was people think in steps, not programs. And they tend to think in sequential steps. And they don't want to feel processed. So it's got to be intuitive and natural. And you've got to fight to understand what that natural next step is, right? And so sequential is important. And so breaking down a long-term commitment to a group into 4 sequential steps that build on each other, giving somebody a giving step that is a low-level commitment, not a tithe, and then following up with them to give them 2 other sequential steps and ladder into a full tithing commitment. Sequential matters, and it's just the logic and nature of it's human nature. And then meaningful, again, that's heart. That is not marketing. That's what do they really need and want next, and how could we help them? So it's being humble enough to go make it meaningful to them right now, and not so much about me yet. And they will, if it is meaningful, they will attend. If your community has a huge problem with personal debt, at the right point in time, helping them get out of personal debt could actually be a baby step toward Jesus, even though they don't know him yet.
Yeah.
So if it's meaningful to them, they'll take it.
Really interesting.
Yeah, I know we're into these 2 principles, but I want to bring us back up to a broad view of the engagement pathway for just a minute. And you hit on something about people not wanting to feel processed. And this is super important for you to understand a couple of rules. The engagement pathway is really a leadership design tool. This is for our team. So to be able to be on the same page and know what we're designing and committing to, as opposed to this is going to go on the wall of the lobby, and that's when people would feel processed. The second piece that I wanted to highlight here is in the bigger picture. Of course, there should be an owner and a champion of your engagement pathway, but here's a concept that we see violated all the time. We all own the engagement pathway. This is our design tool as a leadership team, whether you're staff, volunteer driven. and that we're all owning that and figuring out where my ministry or my piece fits into that engagement pathway, as opposed to, the assimilation person, if you have an assimilation person or a connections person, has that. We want them to champion it, but we all need to understand we are playing from the same song sheet.
Yeah, it's not a processing machine. I wanted to give you one more thing. One of the things we realized at our church was that meaningful meant giving them a chance to own the mission early in the process. So I just thought it was very interesting to watch our engagement go to a whole other level when we could step into the life of our one and realized how far away they really were and how much they had never really owned a mission with a team, in a sense, and gave them that opportunity early. All of a sudden, our ownership of ministry went through the roof, even though these people were still very much early in the journey. So there are things everybody can do to basically move ownership up, make it intuitive so they don't feel processed, and you're going to find their engagement go through the roof.
And that's definitely a value for millennials as well. Yeah. That's a huge deal to be connected to it. The last principle I'm going to leave a little bit of a cliffhanger on. The last principle is that it's measurable. And the reason I don't want to unpack too much is because the book really goes into a lot that we just don't have time to cover. Right. Mm-hmm. But there's some example metrics in there. There's also 10 quick tips for implementation in terms of your engagement pathway. But here's the thing that I'll say about this to wrap our time on this is every church has some way, a new here card, a guest kiosk, a text-in option for the one to reach out and say, I'm here, I like you, I want to learn more. But where too often we see a breakdown is in one of these principles, and we've got to be able to measure it. Just, Pastor, think about the last 4 weekends in your church. You know that there's been new people coming to your church. In fact, right now we're hearing from churches all over. There's a ton of new faces coming back to church post-COVID. But do you know how many? Are you confident that your team followed up with each one? What's the percentage of those who reached out initially who took a next step? How many of them are on their way to knowing and being known in your church? And are you confident that they are on a pathway that's going to keep them connected instead of walking through the front door and going through a revolving back door through the church? All of that takes measurement. And it's not just about metrics and dashboard, but it is in the kind of analysis as well. And man, we could take a whole other episode talking about this. But
can I say one thing?
Please, let me just finish this thought. But I want to hear from both of you because you got that smile on your face. Is the engagement pathway is like a living organism that we're constantly tweaking. It's got to be something. It's got to be trial and error. We've got to do it. So Doug first, then Bart's got something too.
I just want to be respectful of the time, but I got to say this thing because it really is all over the chart. Why do we count in church? For most pastors, that is an emotional question. And my vision cast and what we try to get to in Church OS is we count to better learn and understand if the strategies we are using and working are working or not, and how to take advancing steps to continue to hone it and make it better and more efficient.
That's good.
That would be my thing. Just take the emotion out of counting. We count so we can make it better.
I just thought of this simple question is, do you have an engagement pathway that's stated and measured? And if I came in, I could see it. And if I saw it, because I work with churches all over, I could predict or not that you were on your way to double impact. That's as simple as it should be one day.
Wow.
And that's as simple as it should be for all of us. Mm-hmm. And anyway, that's really how good. Much it matters to the end.
That's a great way to put a bow on a very full episode. So much more in the book. Really encourage you to get it. Thanks for listening today. Next up, we're going to be talking about vision and establishing a true north for your entire team and church to know where God is leading you and your church to have greater kingdom impact. And I doubt anyone listening to this is unfamiliar with the subject of vision, but we want to talk about how helpful it is as a tensioning tool and a focus tool to help make decisions and drive alignment. Who doesn't want alignment throughout your whole team and your whole church? So don't skip this one. As always, for free practical resources to help you where you're at today or to learn more about what we offer, how we can partner with your church, visit intentionalchurches.com. You can follow us on social media to stay connected. Please reach out. Thanks for listening, and we're praying for you.